There's something in the water pretending to be a child, but it's far from human. Today I've got 2 episodes of Tales from the Break Room for you, featuring an hour of terrifyingly true work stories. Demons in the water at summer camp, evil spirits burning in a blizzard, and ghosts who have lost their head at the factory. Enjoy, and be sure to send me your scary work stories at eeriecast.com/submit if you want to hear them narrated on a future episode of Tales from the Break Room. Now, let's begin.
Hi, welcome to Dead and Roasted. What can I get you?
You ever see a fly get trapped in the coffee pot? Sure, some folks say it adds flavor and protein, but the emotion that fly goes through before perishing leaves a scar in that coffee pot. And sometimes, that fly comes back from beyond to haunt your cappuccino. That reminds me of a particular story, actually. One I heard not too long ago. A story about a generator mechanic, a deadly blizzard, and something dark that came back. Enjoy this tale from the break room. Burning, from Robert S. I work as a generator mechanic in a rural part of California, deep in the Sierras at the edge of the Tahoe Forest. People tend to think of California as all beaches and Hollywood, but the reality is that's just 2 major cities, which are surrounded by thousands of miles of rural countryside. With wildfires and severe snowstorms being a regular occurrence, generators are a big part of life around here, and my work revolves around keeping those machines running, which often requires being on call during emergencies. Last winter, a massive storm hammered the Sierras for days on end, and the calls were steadily coming in. It was a variety of typically expected equipment failures, and the usual ridiculous questions. But this wasn't a typical snowstorm. Most locals describe the heavy snowfall and high winds as something they hadn't seen in these mountains in over 40 years. My company only employs a small crew of technicians and electricians, but our trucks are outfitted to respond under all kinds of conditions, as our services are often required when the weather is particularly nasty. Even with the proper gear and vehicles, we were all having to spend tremendous effort just to stay on the road, assuming we could even see them. Falling trees became background noise, punctuating the roaring wind with the occasional thunderclap of breaking wood, followed shortly by the heavy thud that could even be felt through our frozen work boots. The whole crew had met in the shop that morning to attend what had become daily emergency meetings. The usual topics were covered while we refueled chainsaws, loaded portable generators, and prepared for another day battling the elements to get as many people's power back online as we could, or at least able to run their home generators until power could be restored. Large maps of the surrounding areas had been hastily hung up on the walls to keep track of which roads were completely blocked, where the power crews had been, and where they were going to be working next, along with locations of emergency stations for fuel, medical aid, and warming shelters. I was studying these maps while changing out a worn chain on my saw, making notes on some of the new emergency frequencies we'd be using to communicate during the crisis. Cell phone coverage had gone from spotty to nearly non-existent during the storm, forcing us to rely on the radios mounted in the trucks. "And remember," called out the boss man as we prepared to leave for the day, "always check all the way around a downed tree before moving anything from your path to reach a client's home. We don't need another incident like Tuesday. Good luck. Stay safe. Our community needs you all to be able to come back to work." He was referring to an incident a few days back when a tech had tried to move a large fallen tree from across the road and had apparently been electrocuted when he hooked his winch to a tree, which had been lying on top of a live power line. He survived thanks to the fall alarm on our radios, sending out a distress signal whenever they're laid on their side for more than a few minutes. Rescue crews found him lying in the snow by his truck. Both he and the vehicle had sustained extensive burns. He was okay, but was still in the ICU. Due to the combination of his injuries, being frostbite and burns, he had been put under heavy sedation for the time being, but he was expected to pull through. Lucky me, today I was going to be working the calls in his area. I pulled on my snow cap with a built-in LED headlamp that my wife had bought me, pulled my heavy coat tight around my body, and climbed into the cab of my truck. Already warmed up, I dropped into four wheels and started what I thought would be just another day at the office. 8 hours flew past as I went about my calls. Pretty common issues, a tight valve here and a bad mixer there, some electrical troubleshooting. Most everyone I could get to was unbelievably grateful. Some offered tip money, bottles of wine, and even a steak from a cattle rancher that I happily accepted, despite our company policy of not accepting tips. But hey, these were extenuating circumstances, and some folks just won't take, "Sorry, it's against policy," for an answer. Plus, I'm not one to shy away from a good steak, policy or not. I had just finished up my last call and had begun my staging part of the day. Staging is when all the scheduled calls are done, and we have a minute before the emergency calls can be routed to our devices. The interior of the truck is busy looking, crammed full of all the additional accessories we carry around while working emergencies. Cell phone chargers and battery banks plugged into charging ports, radios and docking stations across the dash. A pile of defective or broken parts fill the passenger seat, accompanying the daunting pile of service manuals, tools, bags, and field equipment. I cracked my window as I finished my lunch/dinner, and I lit a cigarette, watching the loading bar on my laptop get to almost full. Then the latest set of emergency calls were brought in. As the pinwheel finally moved again, a new set was uploaded, just as the last of the dim light of day faded away. I looked at the clock on my phone. It was only 5 p.m. 3 more calls. I take a deep breath and sigh heavily. A 12-hour day again. Well, at least I'm making good overtime, I thought. The next call was a no-start on a home generator, and from the notes, it sounded like an easy one, probably just a lack of maintenance. Mentally, I ran through the usual suspects. I'd be out of there in no time. I mentally slapped myself for even thinking that, because while I'm not a believer in much in the way of superstition, I am firm in my confidence that Murphy's Law is very, very real. Anything that can go wrong will go wrong. In my experience, at the end of the day, a plan is just a list of things that didn't happen. I laugh out loud to myself, then stop to touch the pendant I wear around my neck. St. Jude, the patron saint of lost causes and desperate situations. I say to myself, "Oh well, here we go." And I start to drive to the next job site. The location of this next site was pretty remote, even for these parts. As I made my way around the winding, narrow road, I slowly passed the spot where our injured mechanic had his accident. I'm not a particularly religious or spiritual person, but Catholicism has a way of permeating, so I crossed myself and sent out a good thought to the poor guy and his family, hoping whatever powers that be are looking after him, or at least taking some mercy upon him. I mean, geez, this guy was only doing his job, no different than the rest of us. Soon I arrived at the house, which honestly I can't really make out. The level of snow was obscuring the common details I would use to prejudge the situation I was stepping into. Are they older folks and this is their vacation home? Or are they locals who have lived here for decades and finally had to call a repairman because they exhausted all their own attempts to fix the problem? Whatever the case, I threw on my hat with the company logo, donned my shining reflective safety vest, and trudged my way to the front door. The couple that answered the door were obviously in their later years, but they seemed homely and sweet. The husband explained he had tried everything he could think of to use his phrase, get her fired up, but it was to no avail. He was a short and stocky man, wider than I was, and comported himself as a man who had done hard work all his life. He had a thick dark mustache and hard-set eyes, which told me he was a hard-working individual who wasn't at all happy about having to call an outsider in to fix his problem. At first, he attempted to follow me out into the dark, cold night to assist me, but after some coaxing from his wife, who shot me a worried glance, then seemed to check to see where the lights of my truck were pointed, she convinced her husband to stay inside and let the man do his work. He gave her a look that I can honestly only place as gratitude and grumbled his way back into the house to sit by the fire. I noted in that moment that the house itself was well lit with candles and battery-powered lights. Even the exterior was lit up. I was grateful for the wife telling him to leave me to my work. I can appreciate it when people want to learn how to fix things, but this wasn't the time. It's a lot easier to do my job without a watchdog lurking over my shoulder and offering unhelpful advice. Frankly, I've always worked better when left alone. After spending some time digging the generator out of its snow prison with only the headlights of my truck to guide me, I set to work on the diagnosis. I grabbed my impact driver from my tool bag and took the valve cover off. I was confident that this would be an easy fix, and I would be on my way shortly. After one valve adjustment down, I was ready to start the motor. Just then, an error code popped up. Identification error. I stared at it for a moment, then looked to the sky to say, well, screw you then. Great, now I had to update the software. It's not hard to do, just time-consuming, as it starts with an 800-second countdown before the update can take hold. When you're outside in the snow after dark, those are 800 very long seconds. I fumbled around in my pockets, and after some false starts, I got my flash drive plugged into the machine and began the process. Because, well, you never get the USB right the first time. The timer began. I was standing in the cold, roaring wind, the display being the only source of light aside from my tiny flashlight. I make an executive decision to have a smoke while I wait. Normally, the company discourages any smoking on site, but I figured they aren't coming outside to yell at me anytime soon. So I lit up a smoke that I knew the wind was mostly going to smoke for me, but at this point, who cares? Only 758 seconds to go, I thought. I trudge over to the electrical panel to see what circuits will go on first. It's odd. Most people will put the well water or maybe the AC as the first system. But these people set the sodium perimeter lights as the first priority. Odd, but not all that odd, I suppose. After all, what use is anything else if you can't see what you're doing? And with all the wildlife roaming around in this part of the county, like bears, mountain lions, and the like, it makes sense if you have any kind of livestock or house cats. Or, small children. I turned the headlights off in my truck as I no longer needed them for shoveling. And why risk a dead battery way out here at this time of night? Another 554 seconds to go. Rather abruptly, the wind died down. It just stopped. I was grateful. Thank God, I said out loud to myself. I might finally be coming to the part of the night when the snow just gently falls, instead of tiny ice missiles blasting my face all night. I unbuttoned the collar of my coat and shook my beard free. I kept working on my smoke as the countdown continued. I pushed my heavy hood, laden with snow, off my head for a break from the oppressive weight, and only then did I notice it. I noticed just how silent the area around me had become. The storm had been such a constant source of white noise that at first it felt welcome, a relief to have a break from the overbearing roar of sharp wind. That relief was short-lived, and a real feeling of dread began to set in. Silence in the woods is something mountain folk know better than to trust. There's no way to describe it unless you've felt it. Any hiker or hunter can tell you when everything goes quiet, it means a large predator is close by, hiding in the shadows or perched in the trees above, and you would do well to be very aware of your surroundings, and if possible, carefully make your exit. I began scanning the tree line around me, and I almost immediately saw something moving just out of sight range. I squinted hard to try and make out the shape. The occasional brazen deer and other mostly harmless wildlife had been successful in scaring the daylights out of me in the past, when I was least expecting them. So I told myself this was probably just a buck, albeit a big one, moving through. But as I stared into the darkness of the forest, trying to make out the shape of the creature in the shadows, I began to realize something. This was not a single creature. There were multiple creatures, moving about behind the trees, just out of visibility. A herd of deer, maybe. Anxious, I glanced at the countdown, 345 seconds to go. Remember when I said 800 seconds could feel a lot longer? I had a sick feeling growing in my stomach, an instinct that something was horribly wrong, something dangerous. I stayed perfectly still as the shapes moved closer. I don't have the words to describe just how they moved from tree to tree, sticking to the dark patches, and as they moved closer, I was able to see them in better detail, which didn't make things any less terrifying. As they approached and their shapes became easier to make out, they seemed like human figures, for sure. Some tall, some short, almost like a whole group of people. But they couldn't be people, not out here in the woods in this weather. They certainly weren't deer. Their movement was shyly aggressive. They began to remind me of coyotes stalking a potential prey. 115 seconds left. I couldn't make out any detail yet. They all seemed to be cloaked in darkness that remained wrapped around them like a shadow, but darker, unnatural. I told myself not to panic. I'd been working double shifts for days. I was exhausted, and the contrast of snow in the dark can play tricks on your eyes. I tried to tell myself I was just sleep deprived, that I was just working myself up. But as the figures grew closer, that got difficult to convince myself of. I didn't want to take my eyes off of them, but I needed to plot out the best route back to my truck. Problem was, the truck was parked next to the barn, and where I was working on the generator, I was shrouded in shadow from the lights coming out of the windows of the house. Only 30 seconds now. The creatures seemed to fan out. It began to feel as if they were all around me, and they were swiftly closing the distance. I held my breath and took a few steps back, putting my back against the wall of the barn. I exhaled sharply as the fear I'd been holding back shot up from my gut like a shot of electricity. My back to the wall, my eyes darted from figure to figure, and that lizard part of my brain kicked in. I dropped my smoke to free both hands, and I distinctly remember hearing it hiss angrily as it made contact with the snow. I felt sweat beginning to bead on my temples, despite the freezing temperature. The muscles in my leg tightened, and I could feel the veins in my head pulsing, pushing blood past my ears, and a steady thumping roar that mercifully blocked out the awful sound of the complete silence of the snow. Everything seemed to slow down and speed up all at once, and with all hope of reaching the truck in time gone, I lifted my arms to block my face and squeezed my eyes tightly shut, bracing for impact. Then, I heard it. I heard the click of the generator. It had finished its update and was now starting to sputter to life. The engine cranked so loudly I had to cover my ears, and in that moment, despite not putting much stock in prayer, I genuinely prayed that it would start, and maybe someone heard me, because it did just that. With a cough and sputter, the engine came up to speed and began to purr, and with an audible snap, the transfer switch began to power on all the outside lights to the house. I sucked in air. I apparently had stopped breathing. The nervous tension in my chest broke as relief washed over me. I opened my eyes. I wish to this day that I never had. The lights came on slowly at first, a dim orange-pink glow bathing the scene around me, a sickening hue. Eyes attempting to adjust to the new level of visibility, I leaned forward, squinting to see if the figures were in fact just figments of my imagination, a consequence of exhaustion, too many days in crisis mode. I was wrong. As the lights began to chase away the darkness around me, the figures did not disappear with it. Once completely clad in darkness, they were now revealed, and they were very real. The light washed away the obfuscation around them, like wind blowing away ash. My mind tried to slog through the adrenaline dump and process just what it was seeing. They were just people. Men, women, and children. People, not creatures, not predators. My emotional brain breathed a sigh of relief because, hey, it's okay, they're just people. Meanwhile, my logical brain was grabbing the wheel and screaming at me. Something's wrong. Pay attention. My eyes finally caught up. I looked them over, trying to understand what I was seeing. They gazed back at me in silence. Then it dawned on me, and I felt the blood draining out of my face. The clothes. They hung oddly off their bodies, and they were not intended for winter weather, much less a record-breaking snowstorm. Their clothes were ill-fitting and had the look of something homemade. Dirty overalls, hand-sewn pants, prospector hats, and was that a bonnet? They just stood there staring at me, silent as the snowfall, and completely still. 0 seconds left, full power. The sodium perimeter lights kicked on, bathing the entire property in sharp, relentless light, blinding me. My eyes fought to make the transition from straining in the blackness to being bombarded with the sudden illumination. When the light hit the strange people in front of me, they changed. It was like the light itself ripped through them, and I gaped in horror, unable to believe what was happening. All the people standing before me, men, women, and children, began to scream. These were no human screams. The shrill sound pierced my ears and reverberated through my core. It sounded like true agony coming from deep underwater. I covered my ears to block out the chilling sound, but my eyes remained fixed on the nightmare unfolding. Their clothes simply ripped away from them as if scorched off by a fire I could not see, and their flesh began to burn away as well, tearing away from them, ripping into fluttering ashes of red-hot agony. They stood in place, writhing and burning in agony for what should have been only a single second. Then they turned their contorted faces directly toward me. Their eyes. I'll never in all my days forget their eyes. Jaundiced and sick, human but filled with pure hate and rage. The one that had been closest to me fell to its knees and began to crawl towards me, its movements convulsing in torment and anguish. I fell backwards, landing hard on a landscaping rock. With pain shooting through my body, I scrambled to scoot backwards on my butt. The ghoulish figure stretched a smoldering hand out, and I gasped out loud as it grabbed a hold of my foot, its grip too strong to escape. Lifting its head with a tremendous effort, it stared into my eyes, filled with fury but almost pleading. Then it opened its gaping mouth to speak, and the words that shot from its mouth went right through me, haunting me for the rest of my life. With an expression of pure torture, it screamed, "Get the children!" I watched paralyzed as the light finally overtook the wretched creature, and it faded, crumbling into ash, blowing away in the crisp night breeze. I was left there alone in the snow, my pounding heart beating right out of my chest. I looked down and noticed smoke wafting up from my boot. Suddenly I felt searing pain in my toes, like the steel toe of my boot was on fire. Pain is a funny thing, makes you forget absolute terror, at least for a moment. It jolted me out of my shocked stupor, and I reached down and unlaced my boot as fast as I could, tossing it into the gleaming snow. It sizzled for a second, like my cigarette had a lifetime ago, then began to sink into the widening hole around it in the snowbank. As I jammed my foot into the nearest drift to soothe the searing sensation, all the lights in the entire house popped back on, and I heard a sound coming up behind me to my left. Oh no, the family. They were no longer safely inside, and since I had butt scooted far enough toward my truck, I could now see the entrance to the home. The husband, wife, and 2 children had emerged, a boy, maybe around 13, and a girl that looked around 5. They all stood on the porch, holding firearms, even the girl, peering out into the night. After what felt like an eternity, I stood, and feeling suddenly sheepish, I gathered my boot from where it had been thrown. I had no explanation for what just happened, but I tried my best to collect myself. I looked down at my discarded work boot and saw something that, again, I could not explain. A handprint seared into the leather, where whatever that was had placed its hand upon me. I slipped it back on and gathered my composure. I was still on the clock, and my professionalism overpowered my shock and disbelief at what had just happened. Climbing back into the cab of my truck, I located my clipboard and smoothed out the work order. I have no idea why I chose to do this. I think I just needed some sense of order. I clicked my pen and wrote a concise description of the work I performed. Having still not laced the offending boot, and with little stabs of pain causing a slight limp, I awkwardly made my way back onto the porch, the family having apparently retreated back into the house while I focused on my paperwork. I rang the now operational doorbell, and the husband quickly answered. "Get it all worked out?" He watched me closely, an inquisitive look on his face. I tried to steady the trembling in my voice, and I replied, "Yes, sir. She's back up and running." He eyed me intently, searching my face for something, but I was all business. "Hell of a thing you guys do. Not just anyone would come all the way up here to fix something in this kind of storm." I cleared my throat. "We try our best, sir." I answered and finally sounded like myself, going through my standard lines. He continued to study me, which would normally make me uncomfortable, but I was too spent to care. "Why don't you stay here tonight? We've got a nice couch to put you on, and the roads behind you are closed and well." He hesitated, contemplating for a second. "Well, you just did us a real big favor, and we'd like to repay you. Come on in, we'll make you some coffee. You're probably frozen to the bone working out here." I faked a gracious smile, anxious to get as far away from here as possible. "I appreciate that, sir, but I'll have to pass. I've got more calls tonight." The man snorted, gesturing out behind them at the snow which had begun to dump again, already covering my footprints from the truck to the porch. "You ain't getting to them tonight, my friend. Don't be stupid, you're gonna freeze to death. Come on in, let's get you in some dry clothes." He opened the door behind him and reached for my arm to pull me inside, refusing to take no for an answer, but I stepped sideways and just barely skirted his grip. "I appreciate the offer, I really do, but power's out all across town. I have more people out there shivering in the dark that need me." He finally gave up, nodding in defeat and holding out his hand. I take it, give him a nod, and quickly return to my truck to check the weather forecast and wind map on my laptop. The wind map gives those in the field a kind of reference point for where the storm is the worst. Right where the incident occurred on the south side of the property, there was a huge black spot of no wind. It was moving. Whatever it was that had reached out that night wasn't just a random occurrence. It was out there, moving like a living storm within a storm. I grabbed my phone out of my jacket pocket, and I looked at the next call. The next one was along this road and right in this path. Right then, a call came on my work phone. They had figured it out for themselves, thankfully. Call canceled. Okay, I thought to myself, I've had enough of this for one night. Time to go home. I had them sign a work order and took off down the road. The delirium of adrenaline had worn off, leaving me in a bizarre state of almost finding the events humorous. I laughed to myself, saying out loud, "What was that?" I'm used to working under extreme circumstances, but this felt more urgent than anything I'd ever done. I wound my way back down the long, snow-covered road. Once back on the main road, I gathered myself, trying to make sense of what happened, but that proved fruitless. So I just radioed into the home office, stating that I was taking the truck home and I'd be dispatching from home tomorrow. They confirmed and thanked me for all my hard work tonight, saying, "Hey, take the day off tomorrow if you need some rest." I agreed to that offer and immediately headed to the nearest liquor store that was still operational. Securing my liquid therapy for the night, I began to head home down much more familiar and comfortable roads. I pulled into my driveway. I immediately poured a drink from my bottle of whiskey, then another. I went inside and was suddenly overcome with gratitude. I was home safe. It didn't take too much effort to get the fire going again, too. I settled down with my bottle and a small dinner, plugging my laptop into the TV. I ate and drank in silence as I watched that black spot move through the storm until exhaustion and bourbon overcame me. By morning, it was gone, I never got a real explanation for the events of that night, but a few months later I was working around the same area, and I got into a conversation with a client around there. He was a retired land surveyor and spent his retirement locating old mining towns that had been lost to history. He told me that a small mining town had once been somewhere in this area, and he'd been able to locate some piles of stones and a few outlines of the old structures of said town. According to his research, the town had a small schoolhouse, church, and a few houses. Records of the time were mostly gone except one. He showed it to me. It was an old weathered newspaper article that talked about a fire that had broken out in the church. Being there was no such thing as a fire department, the entire town was said to have been lost to that fire. As he showed me the topographical map of where he found the remnants, I recalled the last place I'd seen the black spot on the wind map. It was an identical match. I think now I know what happened to the people that lived there. Did you know I'm making a new trading card game? Go to cryptidcardgame.com to check it out and sign up to be notified when pre-orders are open. You can do battle with your favorite cryptids and mythical creatures, from the legendary Wendigo to the ominous Mothman. That's cryptidcardgame.com.
Hi, welcome to Dead and Roasted. What can I get you?
Usually, I only see things that aren't there when I haven't had my morning coffee. But after a nice 32-ounce espresso and my morning scream, my hallucinations are all gone. But are they really hallucinations? Come on, let's take our break so I can share these new scary work stories with you. But be warned, there will be headless ghosts and an extra kid in the water that simply shouldn't be there. Perhaps it's not a child at all. These are tales from the break room. Headless Horror from Apex Adder. This happened in Moore, Oklahoma, shortly after Halloween in 2019, so no dealing with COVID just yet. I had just moved to Moore to help with some family business. I'd been working in a factory that produced tamales for the Del Real Company for about 2 weeks. I don't work for them anymore, and I've since left the state and moved back to Colorado. For a bit of context, my job back then was on a standing electric forklift. I moved raw goods and produce to the production lines, as well as loaded and unloaded supply trucks and logistics shipments. It was really basic run-of-the-mill warehouse work. Now, since we had raw food that we worked with, there were special doors that were used for the refrigerated areas of the warehouse. These doors were a canvas PVC type material that operated like an overhead garage door. They would open and close via a motion detector as soon as you approached either on foot within the allotted walkway or on a forklift. There was one door in particular that led to a non-temperature controlled area where we stored palletized boxes, and we called it the box room. Now, this door would activate by itself on a regular basis, and I never really thought anything of it. But others would later tell me it was actually an anomaly. It had been addressed to the manufacturer, and they couldn't seem to figure out why it was doing that, even after changing out the motion sensors more than once. One day, I was in the dry area of the warehouse, where there was one of these doors as well, but it wasn't used. I heard my supervisor call me to come and meet her in the box room, which was just on the other side of that door. However, I would need to travel around to the other door, the one that opens by itself, to get into the box room. It's important to note that the box room is in the shape of an L, and the only door we're allowed to use that isn't sealed is located where the L makes its 90-degree angle. The other two doors are at the top of what would be the L shape, one on the left that leads to the warehouse where I just came from, and one across from that, which was a regular person-sized door that led to a part of the factory that wasn't in use since the last company had the building. This door is always locked. You cannot get access from the side I was on. Only from the area that we don't have access to can you turn the door handle and open the door. If it closes, it's locked. We are not allowed to enter that building due to hazardous conditions. Anyway, I leave the dry warehouse and I round the corner. Then I drive towards the box room door and it opens. I continue through the door and it closes behind me. No big deal. As I entered the large L-shaped room, I noticed no one else was in there. I was on a forklift, and whoever called me wouldn't have had the time to walk down to the overhead door and exit without me seeing them. I walked around, and I noticed the door leading to the forbidden factory area was slightly ajar. I figured this is what my supervisor wanted to show me, so I approached and wandered through the door. In front of me was a long hallway that stretched for about 10 to 15 meters before ending at a staircase that led to a second-story office area. Directly to my right was a secondary, shorter hallway that had a women's restroom and a men's restroom on the left, with a small break room at the end of the hallway. There was nothing on the right side of it, as that was the wall that separated the hallway I was in from the box room I just came from. I knocked on the women's restroom door, calling out to my supervisor to see if she was anywhere around, but I didn't get a reply. At this point, I thought she was trying to mess with me, because I'm forever jump-scaring my coworkers. I walked down to the dark break room, and I peered inside. There's a couple of folded-up cafeteria tables and a few stacks of chairs, and the room was empty aside from that. I looked at the floor for shoes poking out somewhere to see if someone was lying in wait for me, but there was nothing. I reached over and turned on the light, and again saw nothing. Not a soul. It was certainly strange to say the least. I started to go over scenarios in my head about what was happening. I decided that I'm not going to walk into a jump scare. If they're going to do that, they can come to me. I shut off the light and began walking back to the box room. I'll be darned if I let anyone get the jump on me. I was so sure then that someone was trying to get back at me. I flicked off the light, and as I saw the lights go out, I turned and began to leave the room. As I crossed the threshold into the hallway, I froze. I don't know why to this day, but I froze. Every hair on my body was standing on end. I can't explain it, but I had an overwhelming feeling of dread. My hands began to sweat, and I felt myself becoming extremely cold. It was like there was just a standing cloud of cold that gripped my entire back. As soon as I felt this cloud, there was an instant tinnitus in my ears, and as I froze, I heard a faint whisper of a woman behind me. She said, "Come look at this." That was not my supervisor's voice. In that moment, I knew the room was empty. I also knew that somehow someone was still talking to me. Again, I cannot explain why, but the feeling of dread was slowly being overrun by the need to turn and look. So, stupidly, I began to turn around. That's when I realized in my mind that if I turned around and looked, I would be the stupid guy I yell at in horror movies to not be stupid. I made the decision to stop turning, and I immediately ran. I couldn't hear anything aside from my heart banging against the back of my head. I reached the door that had previously been left open, but it was closed. I could have sworn I made a point of not letting it close, I thought to myself. I was immediately concerned it was not going to open at all now. I slammed into it as I turned the handle, and luckily, it opened into the box room. I turned then and slammed it shut behind me, looking around for any signs of someone pranking me. But I was still alone. I stood there for a moment, going over what just happened in my mind. I quickly decided to go somewhere else less secluded, somewhere with some nicotine maybe. I never went back there again. You might think this is the end of the story, but it's not. After this happened, I decided to keep it to myself, but I also began asking around about the property and if anyone had potentially died in the factory under strange circumstances. I was later talking to my supervisor, the same one I thought I heard call me to the forbidden area. She told me that about 2 to 3 years prior to Del Real taking over the factory, it had been a different business. There was a guy who was fired from that factory, and when he returned to gather his belongings from his locker, there was an argument between him and another office staff member. he ultimately attacked her and cut off her head with a large knife or machete. The owner of the business at the time was running security and had apparently shot the man, but not before the damage was done. You can actually find the story for yourself. Search for "Man Decapitates Former Coworker in Moore, Oklahoma." This was several years ago now, and I don't recall what happened to the attacker, if he went to prison or if he's dead. But I'm pretty sure that poor woman never left the factory, and she wants people to see what was done to her. The Ghost in Theater 7. From Localady. In 2006, I began working at a local movie theater. I heard several stories of encounters with ghosts and shadow people from the supervisors there, who would spend quite a lot of time alone upstairs, babysitting the projectors and counting tills. Not much happened to me personally until I was promoted to shift supervisor at the end of my first summer break from college. When I started to spend more time upstairs alone, I too had a couple of encounters with something. My first encounter was fairly innocuous. This was back before all the projectors went digital, so we still had to thread film projectors by hand. I was working with one when I saw out of the top of my eye someone walking towards me down the dim hall of the booth. I assumed it was one of my coworkers, as it looked like a man and they were taller than me. The figure came towards me and passed out of sight behind the projector. I waited for him to walk by me, but he never did. I figured he was trying to scare me, so I quickly peeked around the projector. But there was no one there. I walked all around it, but there was nothing. I realized then that the projector I was working with was in Theater 7. You see, most of the stories the others had revolved around this specific theater. I simply pushed it out of my mind, finished threading the projector, and walked away. Nothing else happened that shift. A few months afterwards, I was on a long shift and I had to thread the number 7 projector again. I went upstairs and found that all hell had broken loose. A little background here. A movie film is very large. We have to take 2 or 3 cans of rolled up film and splice them together along with any ads and previews the theater and studios require. There are several places in the movie where we would add a piece of silver tape. This tape was a marker and would signal the projector to do the next in a programmed set of steps to control sound, lights, and the projector itself as the movie progressed. The film would be arranged on a large platter, and it would run from the inside out. The rate at which the film ran was controlled by a device placed in the center of the platter, called the brain. It ran the motor of the platter so the film would run smoothly to the projector and back to another platter on the tree. We used small plastic discs that we called hockey pucks to keep the tail end of the film from flying around and causing problems. These worked well everywhere, except the platters at Theater 7. They would never stick well and would fall off quite often. We all blamed the supposed ghost for messing with stuff. Well, on this particular night, I went upstairs and found the hockey puck from the platter of Theater 7 on the ground, and the tail of the film wrapped around the leading end, tied in a knot on top of the brain. This hadn't stopped the projector from trying to pull the film through itself, though, and as a result, the arm above the projector had been bent straight down, and the film itself was starting to get warped. I quickly shut it off manually, then proceeded to yell at the ghost to stop messing with things, or I'd be calling an exorcist. Nothing noteworthy happened for the rest of the time I worked there. I left the theater for a time, but I stayed friends with a lot of people up there. A few years later, I needed a job again, and I was offered the assistant manager job at the same theater. On my very first shift, I went out to turn on the breakers to the theaters. As soon as I opened the fuse box, I felt this presence whoosh past me. I turned quickly, and I saw a shadow flit down the hall and disappear. Startled, I gathered myself and called out. "Oh, hey, you're still here, huh?" Of course, the ghost said nothing, but I began saying hello whenever I went upstairs. After the theater converted to digital projectors, the activity in the booth went way down. We started to see shadows downstairs, though. A couple of employees and I were getting a ladder out from behind the screen in Theater 7. I was behind the screen, and two of my guys were in the theater, pulling. Suddenly, one of them dropped his side of the ladder, yelling out, "What in the world was that?" I asked him what he was talking about. He said that he saw a dark figure standing at the top of the stairs at the back wall. It shot across the back wall when he noticed it and disappeared. I ducked out from under the screen, and I saw the curtain along the back wall swaying back and forth, but the figure was already gone. The guy apparently freaked out even more when I told him it was probably the ghost. He refused to believe it was a ghost. I don't know what he told himself he'd seen, but I knew what it was. It never did anything malicious. It was a little mischievous, but mostly it was just there. The activity faded over time until, when I left the last time, we hadn't seen anything of it in months. Maybe it got bored with no projectors to mess with, and it finally moved on. Sulphuric Smell and Men in Black. From Anonymous. This happened back when I worked at Starbucks in Rancho Cucamonga, California, at the Victoria Gardens Mall before the Starbucks was relocated to South Main Street. I can't remember the exact day or year, but it must have been between 2014 to October of 2015. I was in college back then. I went to CSUF, and I was really starting to get into spirituality, meditation, and fringe topics like aliens. I found it super interesting to read about the Illuminati and the governments around the world. I was also researching other things like HARP, CERN, Project Bluebeam, and other things like portals, the pyramids, etc. All the things you would call conspiracy theories. My interest in these things was inspired by a childhood event. I recall one night seeing a triangular UFO flying above our house near March Air Force Base. My dad saw it with me. The thing was completely silent. I remember seeing 3 circles in each corner with no lights. It was about a mile above us in the air, traveling northeast. As I grew older, I would share my findings and experiences with those who seemed interested in it, especially at work. And as I said, at the time this happened, I worked at Starbucks. One day I was driving to work. I'm going north up the 15 freeway and a bit before my exit at Foothill Street. Suddenly, I smelled a strong sulfur-like scent in my car. This would remain present all the way to the parking garage. I wasn't sure why it smelled, and why it just carried on with me. I parked and got my things and proceeded to the Starbucks store. Thankfully, the smell did not follow me into the store. It simply remained there and very strong in my car. So I go to clock in, and I was placed on register that day. There was a long line already, and I was ringing up the customers. At one point, a certain customer approached. He was a white, pasty man, probably about 5'7", wearing a black suit, black tie, white undershirt, and he was bald with no visible hair on his face. Also, he was not wearing a hat. What really struck me right away, though, was when he approached, that same strong sulfuric smell hit me, the exact same scent I smelled in my car. The guy smiled creepily the entire time. I remember greeting him, asking him what I could get for him. He ordered a grande black coffee. I grabbed his coffee, and I don't remember how he paid exactly. But I remember him saying and smiling as he said it, "Thank you, Aaron." Then he left. The moment he was gone, that sulfuric smell disappeared. Later on, I thought about it and looked into it, and to this day I swear I must have met a member of the Men in Black. He didn't glitch out as some people report seeing with their Men in Black encounters, and he did have human-like features. He was pasty, creepy, and smelled of sulfur. In the past year, I did smell that smell again, making me a bit paranoid. But that was that. I didn't have any further visitations. To me, it felt as if they were sending a message of, "We are watching you." When I Met Doris, from MontanaRose. I started a new job not all that long ago. I've been in the same line of work for the past 4 years, elderly care and med passing. I currently work at a more family-style assisted living facility in the panhandle of Idaho. I work in the big house, and when I started this house, it had roughly 26 residents in it. During my first week, I was led to believe there was 27. Prior to my start at this facility, 2 residents had contracted COVID and passed over the summer. One of these residents was Doris. On my first night during rounds, I checked room 7 and found someone lying in the bed asleep. I watched and saw clearly the rise and fall of their breathing before I shut the door to check on the next room. I later, several nights later, found out that nobody was in that room. In fact, after viewing it during the day, I discovered there wasn't even any furniture in that room. On my second night around 4 a.m., a small and frail-looking round-faced woman in glasses with wispy hair came shuffling around the downstairs fireplace, holding a comb in one hand and a hair tie in the other. The shuffle of her feet was distinct and rhythmic. I turned to my shift trainer to ask who the resident was, but when I turned back, she was gone. When I explained what I saw, my shift trainer told me that was impossible, because that resident had passed almost an entire month before. This entity bore no ill will. She was merely following the patterns of her life as they'd been for many months before she passed. I've seen her a few times since then. She still comes shuffling from behind the fireplace in the early morning to have her hair done. My last summer camp as a counselor, from Backwoods Hunter. When I was 16, I worked at a kids' summer camp in upstate New York. I had already gone there 5 summers in a row as a camper, so I was very familiar with the owners and staff. It was a small camp, only about 60 people total each year. It was located on a lake, and because no road led to it directly, the camp was only accessible by boat. We stayed in old heavy canvas tents for the duration, which was 2 months. It was a beautiful place, and I was thrilled to experience the counselor side of things. That would change around week 4 that year. Things had been going well. I was having no issues running activities besides that one kid who liked to scream almost 24/7. They were not so happy to be there. Besides that, I also helped during the open swims. This was when the kids could swim in the large main boating area safely, with supervision from most of the staff. Every swim, I would be in a rowboat, keeping it steady outside the swim area while a certified lifeguard sat in the back watching the kids. Every few minutes, the owner standing on the dock would blow a whistle, signifying that we were to count all the kids in the water, making sure none were missing. The kids would each hold up a hand until the count was done. Every staff member had to count the kids and say they had the correct number. On that sunny day, I was having fun keeping the rowboat in place. The whistle blew, and I began the count with all the other staff. Keep in mind, this was the 5th or 6th count of the swim. I knew from the previous counts that the total number of kids that day was 28. As I counted, oddly enough, my total came to 29. Confused, I notified the owner by calling out that I had the wrong total, 29. I watched from the boat as he asked the other staff around him if any new campers were in the water, and they confirmed that 28 was supposed to be the right number. He called on the swim to continue and sort of shrugged. I scrunched my face and nodded back, but couldn't help but feel that something was off. On the next count, I decided to pay extra close attention to the kids while I counted. I wasn't really worried, but I was very curious. At the next whistle, I carefully began counting. I took note of every kid's face before moving to the next. At 16, I stopped. Every kid held up a hand while treading water except for one. This kid was perfectly still in the 10-foot deep water, facing away from me, submerged up to their chin, not holding up their hand. I stared blankly for a moment, then I blinked. When I blinked, the kid was gone. At this time, the other counselors began calling out their totals. One by one, they all exclaimed 28. At this point, I felt as if I must have been seeing things, but I quickly did a recount of the children. 28. I was the last to confirm the count, but for the remainder of the swim, I counted 28 every time. We finished up the swim, and for the rest of the day, I was in a fog. That night, I lay on my cot, staring at the opening in the tent flap for a few hours before sleeping. About a week later, a group of counselors wanted to swim at night after the kids went to bed. This was the area used during open swim, and I thought it'd be fun, so I joined in. I had mostly written off the earlier incident, so I was laughing and messing around with the group. With a smile, I dove into the water from the dock. I came up, turning to face where I had jumped from. I stopped as my eyes fell on a space beneath the dock. Every few feet there were large bright blue barrels fastened beneath the dock to keep it afloat. In one of those open spaces, between two barrels, I saw something silhouetted by lights from a house across the pond. It was a small, perfectly still head peeking from the water. Its features were obscured by shadow, but judging by the shape of the hair, I knew it was the same kid I'd seen earlier. Number 29. I jolted in surprise, sweeping my arms forward to swim away from this figure. In my haste, I splashed water in my eyes, so I had to wipe them clear. When I opened my eyes again, the figure was gone. Quickly, I swam to the dock and pulled myself out. No one seemed to notice what had happened, and I recovered my breath and grabbed my towel. I stayed out for a while, playing it off that I was just cold. As the other counselors swam, I kept my eyes on the dock and the surrounding water. Nothing else happened that night, and we all eventually went to our respective tents. Every sound I heard outside the tent that night made me tense my body up, and I would hold my breath to listen. For the remainder of the summer, I avoided the swim area as much as possible. I would fake illness to not have to assist with rowing. No one seemed to notice, and the day I left, I knew I probably wouldn't be coming back. I have no clue what that thing parading as a child really was, but I know that it scared the heck out of me. I don't know if anyone else that attended the camp saw anything strange, but that was the most unsettling thing I've seen. For all those working at summer camps, be safe and keep your eyes on the water. You never know what is watching. Tales from the Break Room is a viewer-submitted podcast featuring allegedly true scary stories that happened on the way to, on the way from, or at work. If you want your story to be narrated on the show, send it to us at eeriecast.com/submit. As of April 14th, we're paying 3 cents per word for stories that are approved and make it onto the show. Submission does not guarantee approval or payment. For a limited time only, PayPal only. Tales from the Break Room is an EerieCast Network original podcast hosted by Darkness Prevails. You can follow him on Twitter at Dark Prevails, and you can hear thousands more stories read by him on our other show, Unexplained Encounters. If you enjoyed this episode, please follow and rate Tales from the Break Room on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. You can also enjoy plenty more horror-themed podcasts at eeriecast.com.